Good evening all, and welcome back to Grimroot. Tonight, we're descending into the shadowy depths of the Appalachian wilderness with 7 true, disturbing, deep woods horror stories that will chill you to the bone. These are not fictional tales spun around a campfire. They're real encounters from search and rescue teams, loggers, hikers, and mountain families who've called these ancient hollows home for generations. Each account has been passed down through local communities, documented by witnesses who swear by their authenticity, and verified through historical records that reveal the dark secrets these mountains have been keeping. From vengeful spirits of forgotten miners to cryptid creatures that stalk the deepest forest, tonight we explore 7 terrifying encounters that prove some places in America should never be entered alone. If you're new to Grimroot, subscribe now for authentic horror stories that come straight from the witnesses themselves, real people, real terror, real nightmares. Hit that notification bell, because every night we uncover the stories that mainstream media won't touch. Now let's venture into the heart of Appalachian darkness, where the trees whisper secrets of the dead, and something ancient still watches from the shadows. I was leading a search and rescue mission in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, but the hiker we found wasn't the one we were looking for. My name is David Chen, and I've been part of the Shenandoah Valley search and rescue team for 8 years. I've pulled lost hikers out of ravines, found elderly wanderers miles from civilization, and recovered bodies from places that would make your skin crawl. But what happened on Old Rag Mountain in October 2019 still keeps me awake at night, questioning everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. The call came in on a crisp Thursday morning. Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old software engineer from Richmond, had failed to return from a solo hiking trip on the Old Rag Circuit Trail. His girlfriend reported him missing after he didn't show up for work Monday morning. Marcus was described as an experienced hiker, 6 feet tall, brown hair, a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, and always carried a bright orange Osprey backpack. He'd been planning to spend the weekend camping and hiking the more remote sections of the mountain. Our team assembled at the Nethers trailhead before dawn on Friday. Besides myself, we had Sarah Martinez, our tracking specialist, Tom Bradley, a local who'd been hiking these mountains for 30 years, and Jennifer Walsh, our medical officer. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like ghostly fingers, and something about the silence felt different. Heavier than usual. Even the birds seemed subdued. We split into 2 groups to cover more ground. Sarah and Tom took the main Old Rag Trail, while Jen and I headed toward the more treacherous backcountry routes where an injured hiker might have sought shelter. The terrain was brutal, thick underbrush, loose rock faces, and steep drop-offs hidden by decades of fallen leaves. As we climbed higher, the temperature dropped noticeably, and a thin fog began rolling in from the valleys below. Around noon, we heard Tom's voice crackling over the radio. "Base camp, this is Tom. We've got him." Marcus Webb, alive and conscious, about 2 miles up the fire road near Corbin Hollow. The relief in his voice was palpable, and Jen and I immediately began making our way toward their coordinates. But as we hiked, something nagged at me. Tom's voice had sounded off, not quite the enthusiasm you'd expect from finding a missing person alive after 3 days in the wilderness. We found Tom and Sarah about an hour later, standing with a man who perfectly matched Marcus Webb's description: same height, same build, same brown hair. He was even wearing the bright orange Osprey backpack we'd been told to look for. But something was wrong from the moment I laid eyes on him. "Marcus," I called out as we approached. "I'm David Chen with Search and Rescue. Your girlfriend's been worried sick about you." The man turned toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, yes, Rebecca. She worries too much." His voice was pleasant enough, but there was something hollow about it, like an echo in an empty room. "What happened out here?" Jen asked, immediately moving into medical assessment mode. "Where have you been for 3 days?" Got turned around. He said simply, shrugging his shoulders. "Lost track of time. You know how it is in these mountains. All the trails look the same after a while." But that's when I noticed the first inconsistency. This man's hands were clean. Not just relatively clean, but pristine. After 3 days and nights in the wilderness, even the most prepared hiker would have dirt under their fingernails, scratches on their arms, something to show for their ordeal. His hiking boots looked like they'd barely touched the trail. Sarah caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. She'd noticed it too. Tom, however, seemed eager to get moving. "We should head back," he said quickly. "Get him checked out, reunite him with his girlfriend." As we began the hike back down the mountain, I tried to engage Marcus in conversation. "So what do you do for work?" I asked, testing him with information we already knew. "Computer stuff?" he replied vaguely, "programming and such." When I asked about Richmond, where Marcus supposedly lived, his answers were equally non-specific. He described the city in terms so general that anyone who'd visited once could have provided them. No favorite restaurants, no specific neighborhoods, no personal details that would indicate actual familiarity with the area. But it was the scar that really bothered me, or rather, the lack thereof. Marcus Webb's girlfriend had specifically mentioned a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident. This man's face was unmarked. "How did you get that scar?" I asked casually, gesturing toward his left eyebrow. He reached up and touched the spot, and for just a moment, his expression flickered like a mask slipping slightly. "Fell off my bike when I was 7, he said, "but there was no scar there. None at all." I radioed ahead to base camp, requesting that they contact Marcus Webb's girlfriend for additional identifying information. The response came back 20 minutes later. "If Rebecca confirms Marcus has a small birthmark on his right shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. Also, he's allergic to bee stings and carries an EpiPen in his backpack." During our next rest stop, I asked to check his backpack for the EpiPen. Standard procedure for anyone with known allergies. He hesitated for the first time since we'd found him, then slowly removed the orange pack. Inside were generic hiking supplies but no EpiPen, and when he rolled up his sleeve to show me his mosquito bites, his right shoulder was completely unmarked. That's when things got really strange. As the afternoon wore on and we descended deeper into the valley, Marcus began exhibiting behaviors that raised every alarm bell in my head. He walked with an odd, measured gait, as if he was consciously thinking about each step. His responses to our questions became more delayed, as though he was processing the words differently than a normal person would. Most unsettling of all, he never looked directly at any of us for more than a few seconds at a time. Tom kept urging us to move faster, which was unusual for him. In all our years working together, he'd always been methodical, safety-focused. But now he seemed almost panicked to get this man off the mountain. When I tried to slow our pace to do a more thorough medical evaluation, Tom became agitated. "He's fine," Tom insisted. "Let's just get him back to civilization." But Jen wasn't buying it either. During a brief moment when Marcus had wandered a few steps ahead to look at something in the trees, she whispered to me, "His pupils aren't responding normally to light changes, and his pulse is weird. Too slow, too regular. It's like his heart is beating to a metronome." As the sun began to set, we were still several miles from the trailhead. We decided to make camp for the night, rather than risk navigating the rocky terrain in darkness. Marcus didn't seem to have any opinion about this decision, one way or another, which struck me as odd. Most people who'd been lost for days would be eager to get home, to contact their loved ones, to sleep in a real bed. While Tom and Sarah set up the tents, I tried one more test. "Hey, Marcus, want to call Rebecca and let her know you're okay?" I offered him my satellite phone. He stared at the device for several long seconds, as if he'd never seen one before. "Oh, that's all right," he finally said. "I'll surprise her when I get back." That night, none of us slept well. Marcus sat by the dying campfire longer than the rest of us, staring into the flames with an expression I can only describe as empty. When I woke around 2 a.m. to check on him, he was still sitting in exactly the same position, unmoving, unblinking. The fire had burned down to embers, but he made no move to add more wood. "You okay?" I whispered. He turned his head toward me with that same hollow smile. "Just enjoying the peace and quiet," he said, but his voice had changed. It was subtly different, still recognizable as the same person, but with different inflections, as if someone else was learning to use his vocal cords. I pretended to go back to sleep, but I kept watching him through barely cracked eyelids. For the next 2 hours he didn't move, not once. He didn't shift his weight, didn't scratch an itch, didn't even seem to blink. He just sat there, motionless as a statue, staring into the darkness beyond our camp. At dawn, I radioed base camp again. "This is David. I need you to contact the Richmond Police Department and ask them to do a welfare check on Marcus Webb's apartment. Something's not right here." The response came back an hour later, just as we were breaking camp. "David, you need to abort the mission and return immediately. Richmond PD found Marcus Webb's body in his apartment. He's been dead for at least 5 days." My blood turned to ice. I looked over at the man we'd been calling Marcus, who was calmly packing his orange backpack as if he hadn't heard the radio transmission. But I knew he had heard it. And for just a moment, when he glanced up at me, his face seemed to shift. The features remained the same, but there was something predatory in his eyes, something that had never been human. "Tom," I said quietly, "we need to talk." But Tom was already backing away, his face pale with terror. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "It found me first yesterday morning. It was wearing Marcus's face then too, but something was wrong with the eyes. It said if I helped it get off the mountain, it would let me live." Sarah had heard the radio transmission too, and the color had drained from her face. "What is it?" she breathed. The thing that looked like Marcus Webb slowly stood up, and as it did, its appearance began to fluctuate, like looking at someone through heat shimmer. The edges of its form became unstable. It was still recognizably human-shaped, but wrong in ways that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. "You've been very helpful," it said, but the voice was different now, layered, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. I was getting tired of wandering these mountains alone. We ran, all of us. Even Tom, despite whatever deal he thought he'd made. We crashed through the underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, sliding down embankments, driven by a terror so primal it bypassed rational thought. Behind us, something gave chase, but not in any way that made sense. I could hear it moving through the trees, but the sounds came from above us, below us, from directions that should have been impossible. We reached the trailhead as the sun was setting, bursting out of the tree line like we were escaping from hell itself. Our vehicles were waiting where we'd left them, and we didn't stop running until we were all locked inside Tom's truck with the engine running. "What was that thing?" Jennifer gasped, still shaking. None of us had an answer. The official report stated that Marcus Webb died of natural causes in his Richmond apartment, a previously undiagnosed heart condition. The coroner estimated he'd been dead for nearly a week before his girlfriend found him. Our search and rescue mission was logged as unsuccessful, no subject found. But Tom quit the team the next week. Sarah transferred to a unit that operates in the desert southwest, as far from dense forest as she could get. Jennifer still works with us, but she won't take missions in that section of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And me, I still lead search and rescue operations, but I carry different equipment now: silver bullets in my sidearm, iron filings in my pack, and a small mirror that I check constantly to make sure my reflection still looks like me. Because somewhere in those ancient Appalachian mountains, something is still wearing Marcus Webb's face, still carrying his orange backpack, still waiting for the next group of helpful humans to lead it back to civilization. The mountains of Appalachia have been home to things older than human memory, entities that learned long ago how to wear our faces and speak our names. We like to think we've tamed the wilderness, mapped every trail, and cataloged every species. But there are still hollow places in those mountains, dark spaces between the trees, where something watches and waits and learns. And sometimes it follows us home. My grandfather's old moonshine cabin seemed like the perfect retreat until I learned why he abandoned it. My name is Tyler Morrison, and I inherited 43 acres of prime Tennessee mountain land from my grandfather, Ezra, when he passed in the fall of 2018. The property sat in a remote hollow about 20 miles southeast of Gatlinburg, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through thick stands of oak and poplar trees. Grandpa Ezra had been tight, lipped about why he'd left the place to rot for nearly 60 years, always changing the subject whenever I brought up the old cabin or asked about his past. After his funeral, when the deed was finally in my hands, I figured it was time to find out what secrets those mountains were keeping. The drive up to the property took nearly an hour from the main highway, following a twisting path that seemed to get narrower with each mile. Ancient rhododendron bushes pressed close to the road, their twisted branches scraping against my truck as I climbed higher into the hollow. The air grew cooler as I ascended, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves and something else, something acrid that I couldn't quite place. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the first thing that struck me was the silence. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow sound itself. The cabin was in worse shape than I'd expected. Built from hand-hewn logs sometime in the 1920s, according to the county records, it sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. The front porch had partially collapsed, and kudzu vines had claimed most of the eastern wall. But what really caught my attention were the ruins behind the main structure, the crumbling remains of what had clearly been a distillery. Stone foundations outlined where buildings had once stood, and scattered among the weeds were pieces of copper piping, broken mason jars, and the rusted remains of what looked like steel components. This had definitely been a moonshine operation, and a substantial one. I spent that first weekend just exploring, taking photos, and making notes about what repairs would be needed to make the place habitable again. The plan was simple: fix up the cabin as a weekend retreat, and maybe rent it out to hunters during deer season. But as I worked, strange things began happening that made me question whether this was such a good idea after all. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in impossible places. My hammer found balanced on a fence post 50 yards away, my level discovered standing upright in the middle of the creek. At first, I chalked it up to my own absent-mindedness and the disorienting effect of working in an unfamiliar place. It was during my third visit that I first smelled it, the overwhelming stench of rotting grain mash. The odor hit me as soon as I stepped out of my truck, so strong it made my eyes water and my stomach lurch. I searched everywhere for the source, thinking maybe an animal had died somewhere nearby, but found nothing. The smell lingered for hours, then vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the normal forest sense of moss and decay. When I mentioned it to Tom Bradley at the hardware store in town, the same Tom who'd helped with the search and rescue mission I'd heard about, his face went pale, and he quietly suggested I might want to reconsider my renovation plans. The incidents escalated during my fourth weekend at the property. I was replacing rotted floorboards in the cabin when I heard the unmistakable sound of machinery running somewhere in the woods behind the house. It was rhythmic, mechanical, like a pump or some kind of motor churning away. But when I went to investigate, following the sound deeper into the hollow, it would move, always staying just beyond my line of sight. The noise would fade as I approached, then start up again from a different direction, leading me in circles through the thick underbrush until I was thoroughly lost and had to use my phone's GPS to find my way back to the cabin. That night, camping in my tent beside the truck since the cabin wasn't yet habitable, I was awakened by voices. At first, I thought it might be other campers or perhaps hunters passing through, but as I listened more carefully, the conversations didn't make sense. The voices were speaking in the thick mountain dialect of my grandfather's generation, discussing things like the feds coming up the ridge and hiding the copper in the root cellar. The speakers seemed to be moving around the old distillery ruins, and occasionally I could see the faint flicker of what looked like lantern light through the trees. But whenever I worked up the courage to investigate, the voices would stop, and the lights would disappear, leaving me standing alone in the darkness with nothing but the whisper of wind through the leaves. The breakthrough came during my fifth visit when I decided to do some serious excavation around the distillery ruins. Using a metal detector I'd borrowed from a friend, I started systematically sweeping the area where the main still building had once stood. The device went crazy near what had been the northeast corner, beeping frantically over a section of ground that looked no different from any other. I grabbed my shovel and started digging, expecting to find more copper piping or maybe some old equipment that had been buried over the years. Instead, I found bones. Human bones, partially wrapped in what had once been clothing, but was now little more than rotted fabric. The skeleton was incomplete, the skull was missing, and several of the major bones showed clear signs of trauma: deep gouges in the ribs, fractures in the femur, damage that spoke of violence rather than natural death. Beside the remains were the charred fragments of what looked like identification papers and a corroded metal badge that, once cleaned, revealed the words, Internal Revenue Service, beneath decades of rust and corrosion. I immediately stopped digging and called the county sheriff's office, but the response I got was not what I expected. Deputy Sarah Jenkins arrived within an hour, but instead of treating it as a crime scene, she seemed more interested in convincing me to bury the bones and forget what I'd found. That's Federal Agent Marcus Hoffman, she said matter-of-factly, as if she'd been expecting this discovery for years. Went missing in 1927 while investigating illegal distilling operations in this hollow. Everyone in these parts knows the story, but ain't nobody ever talked about it officially. According to Deputy Jenkins, Agent Hoffman had been part of a federal task force sent to shut down the moonshine operations that had made this particular hollow notorious throughout the 1920s. The operation here had been run by a man named Silas Crenshaw, who was known for his violent protection of his territory and his willingness to kill anyone who threatened his business. When Hoffman came up the mountain alone one October night in 1927, planning to gather evidence for a raid, he walked into a trap that Crenshaw had been preparing for weeks. Story goes that Crenshaw caught Hoffman snooping around the still and beat him near to death with a hammer. Jenkins continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Then he threw the body into the furnace they used to heat the mash, burned him along with all his identification. But something went wrong during the burning. Maybe the fire wasn't hot enough, or maybe there was divine intervention, because Agent Hoffman's spirit never left this place. Crenshaw died less than a month later, found at the bottom of his own still with his skull caved in and his body burned beyond recognition. The deputy's story explained a lot about what I'd been experiencing, but it also raised new questions. If Silas Crenshaw had died in 1927, who was responsible for the activity I'd been witnessing? Jenkins had an answer for that too, one that made my blood run cold. Crenshaw's spirit is bound to this place just as much as Agent Hoffman's, she said. But where Hoffman's ghost is angry about his murder, Crenshaw's spirit is protective of his territory. He's still running moonshine up here, still defending his operation from anyone he sees as a threat. And you, with your renovation plans and your weekend visits, you're stirring up a hornet's nest that's been quiet for decades. That night, I made the mistake of staying on the property despite Jenkins's warnings. I wanted to see for myself what was really happening in those woods, to document whatever paranormal activity might be occurring. I set up a camera near the distillery ruins and positioned myself in the cabin with a clear view of the old still site. As darkness fell, the familiar sounds began, the mechanical churning, the voices calling back and forth, the flicker of lantern light among the trees. But this time, I could see more clearly what was happening. Figures moved through the ruins with purpose and efficiency, translucent forms that glowed with a sickly yellow light. They were setting up equipment, hauling copper piping, arranging what looked like barrels and jugs in precise formations. At the center of the activity was a tall, broad-shouldered man in overalls and a felt hat, directing the operation with the authority of someone who'd done this countless times before. Even at a distance, I could see that his face was wrong, partially melted, as if he'd been caught in a fire that had burned away portions of his flesh and left exposed bone gleaming in the spectral light. The man in overalls, who I now realized had to be Silas Crenshaw, suddenly stopped his work and turned to look directly at the cabin where I was hiding. His ruined face split into a grin that revealed teeth like broken glass, and he raised one massive hand to point in my direction. The other spirits immediately stopped what they were doing and began moving toward the cabin, their forms becoming more solid and menacing as they approached. I could hear their boots on the porch, the creak of floorboards as they entered the house, the whispered conversations as they searched room by room. I barely made it to my truck before they found me, crashing through the front door and stumbling down the collapsed porch as ghostly hands reached through the darkness to grab at my clothes. The engine turned over on the third try, and I gunned it down the mountain road without looking back, my headlights illuminating twisted faces in the rear view mirror that seemed to follow me for miles. Behind me, the glow from the hollow grew brighter and brighter, as if the entire mountainside was on fire. I never went back to the property after that night. The next week, I contacted a local real estate agent about selling the land, but she laughed when I told her the location. "Morrison's Hollow," she said. "Honey, that place has been on and off the market for 60 years. Nobody stays there long. Your grandfather was the last person who even tried to make a go of it, and he gave up back in the 50s after his wife left him over what she called the sounds from the ridge." The historical research I did afterward confirmed everything Deputy Jenkins had told me and more. Silas Crenshaw had indeed been one of the most notorious moonshiners in Tennessee during the Prohibition era, known for his violent protection of his territory and his high-quality corn whiskey that commanded premium prices in cities as far away as Chicago. Federal agent Marcus Hoffman had been investigating the operation for months before his disappearance, and his case file, which I obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, contained detailed maps of the hollow and descriptions of the distillery operation that matched exactly what I'd found on the property. But it was the final entry in Hoffman's reports that gave me chills. Written just 2 days before his disappearance eve, Crenshaw operation larger than anticipated. Evidence suggests supernatural protection of site. Local informants refuse to provide intelligence, claim hollow is cursed ground, recommend extreme caution in approach. Something unnatural guards this place. I sold the property 6 months later to a developer from Knoxville who planned to turn it into a hunting lodge. The sale closed in April, and by June, construction crews were reporting the same phenomena I had: missing tools, strange sounds, the overwhelming smell of rotting mash. 3 workers quit after claiming they'd seen burned men walking through the trees, and the project was abandoned by late summer. The developer took a substantial loss on the investment and quietly put the land back on the market. Today, Morrison's Hollow sits empty once again, 43 acres of cursed ground where the dead still tend their stills and protect their territory from the living. Local hunters give it a wide berth, and even the most experienced guides won't take tourists into that part of the mountains. The county has posted warning signs about unstable ground conditions, but the real danger isn't from sinkholes or rock slides. Sometimes on clear autumn nights when the wind is blowing just right, people in Gatlinburg claim they can smell corn mash cooking somewhere up in the mountains. The local sheriff's department doesn't investigate these reports anymore, having learned long ago that some operations are better left undisturbed. Because in the hollows of Appalachia, the dead don't always rest easy, especially when they died protecting something they valued more than their own lives. And somewhere up in those dark woods, Silas Crenshaw is still making moonshine, still defending his territory, still burning anyone foolish enough to threaten his operation. Agent Hoffman may have gotten his justice in the end, but it came at a price that continues to be paid by anyone who disturbs the peace of Morrison's Hollow. The mountains remember their secrets, and some curses run deeper than any grave. The abandoned coal mine was supposed to be sealed, but something was still calling from inside. My name is Rachel Torres, and I work as a geological surveyor for the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. Part of my job involves inspecting old mining sites to ensure they're properly sealed and pose no environmental hazards to surrounding communities. In September 2020, I was assigned to investigate the old Black Rock mine near the town of Bramwell, a coal extraction site that had been officially closed since 1902 following a catastrophic collapse that killed dozens of workers. What I discovered there challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundary between the living and the dead. The drive to Black Rock took me deep into the mountains of McDowell County, through countryside that bore the scars of over a century of coal mining. Abandoned tipples dotted the landscape like skeletal remains, and the creeks ran orange with acid mine drainage that had been seeping from old workings for generations. The closer I got to the Black Rock site, the more desolate the terrain became. Trees grew stunted and sparse, their leaves yellowed even in early autumn, and the few houses I passed looked abandoned, their windows boarded up and their yards overgrown with weeds that seemed to struggle for survival in the contaminated soil. The mine entrance itself was located at the end of a rutted dirt road that climbed steadily for 3 miles through a hollow so narrow that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor. According to my files, the site had been sealed with concrete and steel barriers in 1923, then reinforced again in 1965 and most recently in 1994. But as my truck rounded the final bend and the mine portal came into view, I could immediately see that something was wrong. The concrete barrier that should have completely blocked the entrance had a gap in it. Not a small crack from settling or weather damage, but a deliberate opening about 3 feet wide that looked like it had been carefully maintained over many years. I parked my truck and approached the entrance with growing unease. The gap in the barrier was too precise to be accidental, its edges smooth, as if someone had been regularly clearing away debris and vegetation to keep it open. Fresh footprints in the mud around the entrance showed that people had been visiting this site recently, despite the numerous warning signs posted by the state and federal mining agencies. But what disturbed me most was the sound coming from inside the mine, a faint chorus of voices that seemed to rise and fall like a children's choir practicing in the distance. My initial assumption was that local kids had been using the mine as a hangout despite the obvious dangers. Abandoned mines are death traps filled with toxic gases, unstable ground, and hidden shafts that can drop hundreds of feet into flooded tunnels. I called out toward the entrance, identifying myself as a state inspector and warning anyone inside to come out immediately. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Then, after several minutes, the singing resumed. But now it sounded different, sadder, more distant, as if the singers were moving deeper into the mountain. I should have left immediately to call for backup from the state police, but something about those voices compelled me to investigate further. They were definitely children's voices. But there was something wrong with the melody they were singing. It wasn't any song I recognized, but rather a mournful tune that seemed to speak of loss and longing in a way that made my chest tighten with inexplicable sadness. Against every safety protocol I'd ever learned, I grabbed my flashlight and safety equipment and approached the mine entrance. The tunnel beyond the barrier stretched into absolute darkness, its walls supported by rotting timber that creaked ominously in the slight breeze that flowed from the depths. The air was cold and damp, carrying the metallic taste of iron and the acrid smell of sulfur compounds that indicated dangerous gas concentrations. But mixed with these industrial odors was something else, the faint scent of wood smoke and kerosene, as if someone had been burning lamps deep in the mine. The children's voices continued to echo from somewhere ahead, their song weaving through the darkness like a thread I couldn't help but follow. As I moved deeper into the mine, my flashlight beam revealed evidence of recent human activity that made no sense given the site's official status. Fresh candle wax pooled on rock ledges, and someone had arranged small stones into neat piles at regular intervals along the tunnel walls. Most disturbing were the toys scattered throughout the passageway: wooden horses, corn-husk dolls, marbles, and other playthings that looked handmade and decades old. They were positioned as if children had been playing with them recently, but the toys themselves belonged to an earlier era, the kind of simple items that poor mining families might have crafted for their children in the early 1900s. About 200 yards into the mine, the main tunnel branched into several smaller passages that disappeared into the mountain like the fingers of a giant hand. The singing was coming from the passage on my right, accompanied now by other sounds: the scrape of small feet on stone, the whisper of cloth brushing against rock walls, and occasionally, what sounded like muffled laughter or crying. I followed the sounds deeper into the mine, my flashlight beam dancing across walls that showed the crude tool marks of pick and shovel excavation from over a century ago. The passage opened into a natural cavern that had been enlarged by the miners, its ceilings supported by massive wooden posts that somehow still looked solid despite their age. But what stopped me cold was what I saw in the center of the chamber. Dozens of small figures sat in a circle on the cavern floor, their forms translucent and shimmering in my flashlight beam like heat mirages. They appeared to be children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 14, dressed in the simple work clothes of early 20th century mining families: patched overalls, worn cotton shirts, and shoes that were little more than leather scraps tied with string. The children were singing in voices that seemed to come from both everywhere and nowhere, their melody rising and falling in harmonies that no human throat could produce. As my light played across their faces, I realized with growing horror that many of them showed signs of terrible injury. Some had crushed skulls or missing limbs, others bore the black marks of coal, dust permanently embedded in their skin, and several appeared to have died from the kind of lung disease that came from breathing coal dust for years. These weren't living children playing in an abandoned mine. They were the spirits of young people who had died here, trapped forever in the darkness, where their short lives had ended. As I stood frozen in shock, one of the children, a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, looked up from the circle and made eye contact with me. His face was pale as limestone, and when he smiled, I could see that several of his teeth were missing, knocked out by some long-ago accident. He raised one translucent hand and beckoned for me to join their circle, his mouth moving as if he were speaking, though I could hear nothing but the continued singing from the group. That's when the truth of what had happened here crashed over me like a physical blow. These weren't just the spirits of children who had died in the mine. They were child laborers, boys and girls who had worked in the tunnels alongside the adult miners because their families needed every penny they could earn to survive. In 1902, when the Black Rock mine collapsed, it hadn't just killed grown men with families. It had also crushed dozens of children who should have been in school, instead of crawling through narrow passages to retrieve coal cars or operating dangerous equipment in spaces too small for adult workers. The boy who had beckoned to me stood up from the circle and began walking toward me, his movement silent despite the rocky floor. As he approached, I could see the coal dust ground so deeply into his skin that it formed permanent black tattoos across his arms and face. His overalls were torn and bloody from cave-ins and accidents that had occurred over a century ago, but his eyes held a kindness that was heartbreaking in its innocence. When he reached me, he opened his mouth and spoke, though his voice seemed to come from the walls of the cavern itself, rather than from his translucent form. "We've been waiting so long," he said, his words carrying the thick Appalachian accent of his era. "Nobody ever comes to see us anymore. Nobody remembers we were here." Behind him, the other children had stopped singing and were now looking at me with expressions of desperate hope, as if my presence offered some possibility of relief from their eternal imprisonment in the darkness. "We didn't mean to die," continued a girl who looked to be about 12, her voice joining the boys in that strange ventriloquism that seemed to emanate from the mine itself. "We were just trying to help our families. Papa said we had to work or we'd all starve, but the mountain fell on us, and now we can't go home." Tears that glowed with their own pale light traced tracks through the coal dust on her cheeks. The boy who had first approached me reached out with one ghostly hand and touched my arm. The contact was cold beyond description but not unpleasant, more like being touched by morning mist than by anything solid. "Will you tell people about us?" he asked. "Will you let them know we were real, that we mattered?" His request was so simple, so heartbreaking in its humility, that I finally found my voice. "Yes," I whispered, the word echoing through the cavern like a promise. "I'll tell everyone. You won't be forgotten anymore." As soon as I spoke those words, the children's expressions changed from desperation to something approaching peace. Their translucent forms became even more faded, as if my promise had begun to release them from their earthly bonds. One by one, the children began to fade away, but not before each of them approached me to whisper their name and age at the time of their death. Tommy Henderson, age 8, Mary Catherine Burke, age 11, James Russell Morgan, age 13, Samuel Davis, age 7. The litany continued until nearly 4 dozen names had been spoken, each one burning itself into my memory with perfect clarity. As the last child faded from view, the cavern fell completely silent for the first time since I'd entered the mine. I made my way back to the entrance in a daze, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced. Once I reached my truck, I immediately began researching the history of the Black Rock mine, using every database and archive I could access. What I found confirmed the children's stories in heartbreaking detail. The mine collapse of October 1902 had indeed killed 43 people, including 28 children between the ages of 7 and 15. The official records listed them as workers, but contemporary newspaper accounts revealed the truth. They were child laborers whose families had been desperate enough to send them into the mines despite the obvious dangers. The mine had been sealed not just for safety reasons, but because the local community wanted to forget what had happened there. I included everything I'd learned in my official report to the state, recommending that the mine be properly sealed, but also that a memorial be erected to honor the children who had died there. The memorial was dedicated 6 months later, a simple granite marker bearing all 43 names and ages, along with an inscription that reads "Sepizes in memory of the children of Black Rock Mine, whose short lives ended in darkness, but whose courage lights the way for future generations." Since the memorial was installed, local residents report that the children's voices are no longer heard from the mine. The entrance has been permanently sealed with a concrete barrier that shows no signs of mysterious gaps or maintenance. Flowers appear regularly at the memorial, left by visitors who come to pay their respects to children who died over a century ago, but are finally being remembered and honored as they deserve to be. But sometimes, especially on quiet autumn evenings when the mist rises from the hollows, hikers in the area report hearing faint voices singing somewhere in the distance. Not the mournful tune I heard in the mine, but something lighter and happier, like children at play in fields where the sun always shines and no mountain can ever fall on them again. The children of Black Rock Mine found their peace at last, not through forgetting but through remembrance, not through denial of their suffering, but through acknowledgement of their worth and dignity as human beings who deserved better than the world they were born into. The old hiking trail on our property had been closed for decades, but something kept clearing the brush. My name is Michael Sutton, and my family owns 300 acres of mountainside in the Blue Ridge region of North Carolina, land that's been in the Sutton family for 5 generations. The property includes dense hardwood forest, 2 clear mountain streams, and what locals call Devil's Ridge, a narrow spine of granite that runs along our eastern boundary like the backbone of some sleeping giant. It was along this ridge that we discovered the trail that shouldn't have existed, maintained by hands that belonged to no living person. I first noticed the path during a boundary survey in early spring of 2021. My father had passed the previous winter, leaving me to sort through decades of property records and survey maps that painted a confusing picture of exactly where our land began and ended. Armed with a GPS unit and copies of deeds dating back to the 1890s, I set out to walk the perimeter and settle the boundaries once and for all. The eastern section along Devil's Ridge was supposed to be impenetrable forest, thick with mountain laurel and rhododendron that formed an almost solid wall of vegetation. But as I climbed toward the ridgeline, I discovered a clearly defined trail cutting through the undergrowth like a knife through butter. The path was roughly 4 feet wide and appeared to have been recently maintained. Someone had carefully pruned back the laurel branches, cleared fallen logs, and even laid flat stones across the muddy sections to create a walkable surface. But according to every map I'd studied, this trail didn't exist. The last official path through this section of the mountains had been abandoned in the 1960s, and it had followed a completely different route through the valley below. Yet here was a trail that looked like it received regular maintenance, winding up the mountainside with the kind of confident curves that spoke of someone who knew these mountains intimately. Curiosity got the better of my caution, and I decided to follow the path to see where it led. The trail climbed steadily through stands of old, growth oak and poplar, their massive trunks creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that felt both peaceful and somehow watchful. Every 100 yards or so, I encountered something that made me stop and examine my surroundings more carefully. Small piles of stones had been arranged in precise patterns beside the trail. Not random cairns left by hikers, but deliberate constructions that looked almost like altars or markers. Each pile consisted of exactly 13 stones arranged in a spiral pattern with a larger central stone that had been carved with symbols I didn't recognize. As I climbed higher, the markers became more elaborate. Bundles of dried herbs hung from tree branches at regular intervals, filling the air with scents of sage, rosemary, and other plants I couldn't identify. The herbs were fresh enough that their aromatic oils still perfumed the mountain air, suggesting they'd been placed recently despite the trail's apparent abandonment. Strips of cloth in deep red and black had been tied to certain trees, always at eye level and always on trees that showed signs of careful tending, their bark cleaned of moss and lichen, their surrounding ground cleared of undergrowth. The trail eventually led to a clearing near the top of Devil's Ridge, a circular meadow about 50 feet across that felt like stepping into another world entirely. The grass here grew in perfect concentric circles, each ring a slightly different shade of green, creating a natural mandala that was too precise to be accidental. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak tree, unlike any I'd ever seen. Its trunk was easily 8 feet in diameter, and its branches spread out in perfectly symmetrical patterns that seemed to defy the random growth typical of forest trees. The bark was covered with carved symbols. Some looked like letters from alphabets I didn't recognize. Others were geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which you viewed them. Around the base of the great oak, someone had arranged a circle of flat stones, each about the size of a dinner plate, and carved with individual symbols that matched those on the tree trunk. Between the stones, small offerings had been placed: bundles of wildflowers, polished river rocks, carved pieces of wood that looked like miniature totems or protective charms. Everything was fresh and carefully arranged, as if someone visited this place regularly to tend to its maintenance and add new offerings to the collection. I photographed everything I could, then made my way back down the trail with more questions than answers. That evening, I drove into the nearest town to visit Elmira Patterson, an elderly woman who'd grown up in these mountains and served as the unofficial historian for our corner of Appalachia. Mrs. Patterson was in her 80s but still sharp as a tack, and she'd made it her life's work to preserve the stories and traditions that the mountains had nearly forgotten. When I described what I'd found on Devil's Ridge, her reaction was immediate and intense. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, her weathered hands gripping the arms of her rocking chair until her knuckles went white. "You found Granny Blackwood's trail. I was hoping that path had finally grown over and been forgotten." She looked at me with eyes that held a mixture of fear and respect. "Michael, you need to stay away from that place. Granny Blackwood's been gone for 30 years, but her trail stays open because she ain't really gone. Not completely." According to Mrs. Patterson, Eliza Blackwood had been what mountain people called a root woman, someone who practiced the old folk magic that had been brought to Appalachia by Scottish and Irish immigrants centuries ago. Granny Blackwood had lived alone on Devil's Ridge from the 1940s until her death in 1991, surviving on knowledge of herbal medicine, weather prediction, and what locals carefully referred to as the old ways. People came to her from all over the region seeking remedies for ailments that conventional medicine couldn't cure, predictions about the weather or the outcome of crops, and occasionally for help with more serious problems that required what she called deeper workings. Granny Blackwood wasn't evil, Mrs. Patterson was careful to explain. She helped a lot of folks over the years, delivered babies when doctors couldn't get up the mountain, healed sickness with her herb knowledge, found lost children and livestock. But she was powerful in ways that made people nervous. She could call rain during droughts, could make crops grow in soil that shouldn't support anything, could see things that were going to happen weeks before they came to pass. And toward the end of her life, she started talking about making sure her knowledge wouldn't die with her, about finding a way to keep the old protections active even after she was gone. The trail I discovered was Granny Blackwood's sacred path, the route she'd used for 50 years to access her working spaces and tend to the spiritual protection she'd placed around the mountain. The symbols carved into the trees and stones were protective wards, designed to keep harmful entities away from the local community, while the offerings and markers served as focal points for rituals that maintained the balance between the human world and the wilderness spirits that dwelled in the deep mountains. According to Mrs. Patterson, these protections had kept the area safe from the kinds of supernatural threats that plagued other parts of Appalachia. No cryptid sightings, no mysterious disappearances, no malevolent hauntings that drove families from their homes. But the most disturbing part of Mrs. Patterson's account was her description of Granny Blackwood's final years. As her death approached, the old woman had become obsessed with ensuring the continuity of her protective work. She'd spent months performing increasingly complex rituals designed to bind her spirit to the mountain itself, creating what she called a watching presence that would maintain her wards and protections long after her physical death. The last time anyone had seen her alive, she'd been walking up the trail toward Devil's Ridge, carrying a satchel of mysterious items and muttering about the final working. They found her body 3 days later at the base of that big oak tree. Mrs. Patterson concluded. Natural causes, the coroner said, just old age and a weak heart. But the folks who found her said she looked peaceful, like she'd accomplished something important. And ever since then, that trail stayed clear, the markers stay fresh, and the protections she set up still work. Granny Blackwood's still up there, Michael. Still doing her work, and you don't want to interfere with something like that. Despite Mrs. Patterson's warnings, I found myself drawn back to the trail repeatedly over the following weeks. Each time I visited, I noticed subtle changes that confirmed someone was indeed maintaining the path and tending to the sacred sites. Fresh herbs would appear hanging from the branches, new stones would be added to the existing cairns, and the offerings around the great oak were regularly refreshed with flowers that couldn't possibly grow wild at that elevation. Most unsettling was the way the trail itself seemed to adapt to changing conditions. After a heavy rain that should have washed out sections of the path, I'd returned to find that someone had laid new stones and cleared new drainage channels to prevent erosion. My closest encounter with the presence that maintained the trail came during a visit in late autumn. I'd climbed to the sacred clearing just as sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, planning to photograph the great oak in the golden light. As I worked with my camera, the temperature began dropping rapidly, and mist started rising from the forest floor around the clearing. Within minutes, I was surrounded by fog so thick I could barely see the oak tree 20 feet away. That's when I heard her voice, an elderly woman speaking in the thick mountain dialect of Granny Blackwood's generation, her words seeming to come from the mist itself, rather than from any specific direction. "You're Jacob Sutton's boy," the voice said, not a question but a statement of recognition. "Your great-grandmother brought you to see me when you were just a baby, sick with fever that wouldn't break. I remember you." I tried to respond, to ask who was speaking, but the words stuck in my throat as a figure began materializing in the mist near the base of the oak tree. She was tall and lean, dressed in the simple mountain clothing of an earlier era, long dark skirt, hand-knitted sweater, and a shawl draped over her shoulders. Her hair was white as mountain snow and braided down her back, and her eyes held a depth of knowledge that seemed to encompass decades of experience with forces beyond normal human understanding. "Don't be afraid, child," Granny Blackwood's spirit said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority that Mrs. Patterson had described. "I mean no harm to your family or your land. I'm just maintaining the old agreements, keeping the balance that's protected these mountains for longer than you know. But you've been walking my trail, disturbing my workings, and that's going to cause problems if it continues." She gestured toward the carved symbols on the oak tree, and I could see that they were glowing with a faint blue light that pulsed in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. "These protections require careful tending," she explained. "The wrong kind of attention, the wrong kind of energy, can disrupt the patterns I've spent decades weaving. You're a good man with good intentions, but you're not trained in the old ways. Your presence here is like dropping stones in a still pond. The ripples spread out and affect things you can't see or understand." Granny Blackwood's spirit walked closer, and I could see that her form was translucent, like looking at someone through clear water, but her presence felt completely real, completely solid, as if death had changed her nature but not diminished her power. "I'm going to offer you a choice," she said, stopping just outside the ring of carved stones. "You can continue to use this trail, but only if you're willing to learn what it means to walk it properly. I'll teach you the old ways, show you how to tend the protections and maintain the balance. It's knowledge your family once had but forgot over the generations. Or you can stay away from this path, respect the work I'm doing here, and trust that some things are better left to those who understand them." The weight of her offer settled over me like a physical presence. I realized that I was being invited into something far older and more significant than I'd understood. Not just a hiking trail, but a tradition of mountain wisdom that connected the human community to the spiritual forces of the wilderness. After a long moment of consideration, I made my decision. I want to learn, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. If you're willing to teach me, I'm willing to learn the right way to walk this path. Granny Blackwood's spirit smiled, and for an instant, the mist around us seemed to glow with warm, golden light. Then we'll begin with the next full moon, she said. Come to the clearing at midnight, bring offerings of local wildflowers and spring water, and wear clothes of natural fiber with no metal fastenings. I'll start teaching you the basics of reading the signs and maintaining the markers. But understand this: once you begin learning the old ways, you'll be responsible for continuing the work. This knowledge doesn't come without obligations. The mist began to dissipate as quickly as it had formed, and Granny Blackwood's spirit faded with it, leaving me alone in the clearing as the last light of sunset disappeared behind the mountains. Over the following months, I returned to the clearing at each full moon, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated the health of the mountain's spiritual ecosystem, understanding the purposes behind the various symbols and markers, and gradually taking on more responsibility for maintaining the protections that Granny Blackwood had established. The trail remains active today, but now I understand that it was never just a hiking path. It's a working space, a sacred route that connects the human world to older powers that still watch over these mountains. Granny Blackwood continues her work, but now she has a living partner who can tend to the physical aspects of maintaining the trail, while she handles the spiritual dimensions that require her unique gifts. The old agreements remain in force, the balance is maintained, and the community continues to benefit from protections that most people never realize exist. But sometimes, when I'm working alone on the trail, I catch glimpses of other figures moving through the forest, previous generations of root workers and mountain-wise folk who've chosen to continue their protective work beyond death. The tradition is older than any of us realized, stretching back to the first people who recognized these mountains as sacred space worthy of respect and protection. Granny Blackwood was just the most recent keeper of knowledge that connects the present to powers and purposes that extend far beyond individual human lifespans. My logging crew had worked these Kentucky mountains for years, but we'd never seen trees snapped like matchsticks overnight. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been running timber operations in the Daniel Boone National Forest for 15 years. I've cut oak and poplar from every ridge and hollow in eastern Kentucky, worked through storms that could level entire stands of trees, and dealt with every kind of dangerous wildlife these mountains have to offer. But what happened in the fall of 2019 near Red River Gorge still makes me check the tree line twice before I step out of my truck. We'd been contracted to do selective logging on a 40-acre tract in the deep woods, about 12 miles southeast of Slade, Kentucky. The area was remote even by our standards: no cell phone service, no nearby roads, just virgin forest that hadn't been touched by human activity in decades. The Kentucky Department of Natural Resources had marked specific trees for removal, mostly diseased oaks and overgrown poplars that were crowding out younger growth. It was good, honest work that would help the forest stay healthy while providing timber for local mills. What we didn't know was that we were entering territory that something else considered its own. My crew consisted of 4 experienced men who'd been working with me for years. Tommy Hendricks ran the chainsaw, Marcus Webb operated our small bulldozer for moving logs, Carl Jenkins handled the chainsaw maintenance and safety gear, and Jimmy Patterson served as our spotter and general backup. We set up our base camp on a Tuesday morning, parking our equipment trailer at the end of an old fire road that barely qualified as passable. The forest around us was thick with mature hardwoods, oaks that must have been over 200 years old, towering poplars that disappeared into the canopy, and an understory so dense you couldn't see more than 50 feet in any direction. The first sign something was wrong came at the end of our second day. We'd made good progress, dropping 3 large diseased oaks and cutting them into manageable sections for transport. But when we returned to the site the next morning, we found something that defied explanation. 2 of the oak sections we'd cut, each one weighing over 1,000 pounds, had been moved during the night. Not rolled or dragged, but lifted and carried about 30 yards deeper into the forest, where they'd been carefully stacked against a massive boulder like cordwood. Tommy was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "Ain't no way the wind did that," he said, running his hand through his graying beard. "And there's no equipment tracks. Something picked up them logs and carried them off like they were matchsticks." The ground where the logs had originally been placed showed clear, deep prints that looked almost human, but were easily twice the size of a man's boot, and sunk so far into the earth that whatever made them had to weigh at least twice what any of us did. We should have packed up and left right then, but we had a contract to fulfill and families to feed. Instead, we convinced ourselves there had to be a rational explanation, maybe other loggers working nearby, maybe some kind of heavy equipment we hadn't heard operating. But as we worked that day, the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing hour. The normal sounds of the forest, bird calls, rustling leaves, the chatter of squirrels, gradually faded away until we were working in an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the noise of our chainsaws and machinery. It was Carl who first noticed the claw marks. We were taking a lunch break when he called us over to examine a stand of mature poplars about 50 yards from where we'd been working. The trees showed deep gouges in their bark, parallel scratches that ran from about 7 feet high down to the ground. The marks were fresh, the wood underneath still light, colored in weeping sap. But what made our blood run cold was the spacing of the scratches. They indicated claws or fingers that were at least 8 inches apart, belonging to hands that would dwarf those of any human. "Black bear," Marcus suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We'd all seen bear sign before, and this wasn't it. The scratches were too deep, too deliberate, and positioned too high on the trees. Even a large black bear couldn't reach 7 feet while standing on its hind legs, and the pattern of marks suggested something that walked upright as its natural posture rather than occasionally rearing up on its back legs. That night, we decided to post a watch rotation rather than all sleeping at the same time. Jimmy took the first shift, sitting by our campfire with a clear view of the equipment and the tree line. Around midnight, he woke the rest of us with urgent whispers. "Something's out there," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Been moving around in the trees for the last hour. Big, real big." We grabbed our flashlights and spread out in a defensive line, scanning the darkness beyond our camp. At first, we saw nothing but the familiar silhouettes of trees and undergrowth. Then Tommy's light caught something that made us all freeze. 2 red points of light glowed back at us from the forest, positioned about 8 feet off the ground and spaced too far apart to be those of any normal animal. As we watched, the lights moved. Not the random bobbing of an animal's head, but the deliberate, measured movement of something that was studying us as intently as we were trying to see it. "What the hell is that?" Carl whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. The red lights held steady for several more seconds, then vanished as if someone had switched them off. We spent the rest of the night huddled around our fire, taking turns keeping watch, but we didn't see the lights again. When dawn finally broke, we found fresh tracks around the perimeter of our camp, the same massive, human-like impressions we'd discovered at the logging site, but now circling our sleeping area like a predator evaluating its prey. The next day brought the incident that finally convinced us. We were dealing with something beyond our understanding. We were working on felling a particularly large oak when the forest suddenly went completely silent. Not the gradual quieting we'd been experiencing, but an instant, total absence of sound that was so profound it felt like a physical presence pressing against our eardrums. Tommy shut off his chainsaw, and in the sudden quiet, we could hear something moving through the underbrush toward our position. The sounds weren't quite right for any animal we knew. Too heavy and deliberate for a deer, too large for a black bear, and accompanied by a rhythmic cracking of branches that suggested something was deliberately breaking its way through the forest rather than following existing paths. As the sounds grew closer, a smell reached us that made our stomachs churn, a mixture of rotting meat, wet fur, and something else that reminded me of the sulfur stench that comes from deep caves or abandoned mines. Then we saw it. The creature emerged from a thicket about 30 yards away, moving upright on 2 legs but with a gait that was unmistakably inhuman. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to span nearly 4 feet across. Its entire body was covered in coarse, dark hair that looked matted and greasy, like it had been living rough in the wilderness for years. The head was the most disturbing part, essentially human in shape, but wrong in every detail. The face was flatter than a person's, with a protruding jaw full of yellowed teeth that looked designed for tearing rather than chewing. But it was the eyes that truly terrified us, intelligent, calculating, and glowing with that same red light we'd seen the night before. The beast stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, examining us with the kind of focused attention that predators reserve for potential prey. Its massive hands hung at its sides, and I could see that the fingers ended in claws that could have easily created the marks we'd found on the poplar trees. When it breathed, its chest rose and fell with the deliberate rhythm of something that was completely at ease in its environment, unafraid and unthreatened by our presence. Tommy was the first to break. He dropped his chainsaw where he stood and took off running down the fire road, crashing through the underbrush like a man fleeing for his life. His panic was contagious, and within seconds, the rest of us were following suit, abandoning thousands of dollars worth of equipment in our desperate flight from whatever was watching us from the tree line. Behind us, we could hear the creature moving, not chasing us, but paralleling our path through the forest, keeping pace with our terrified flight, as if it were escorting us off its territory. We didn't stop running until we reached our trucks, and even then, we didn't feel safe until we were miles away from the forest and back on the main highway. It wasn't until we reached Slade and stopped at a diner to catch our breath that we realized none of us had suffered so much as a scratch during our panicked retreat. Whatever the creature was, it hadn't tried to hurt us. It had simply made it clear that we were no longer welcome in its domain. The next day, I called the Kentucky Department of Natural Resources to report the incident and request permission to retrieve our equipment. The response I got was not what I expected. The forestry official I spoke with listened to my story without interruption, then told me that our logging contract had been administratively suspended due to unexpected wildlife concerns in the operational area. When I pressed for details, he simply said that other contractors had reported unusual animal activity in that section of the forest, and that the area was being temporarily closed to commercial operations pending further investigation. We never got our equipment back. 3 weeks later, I received a check from the state that covered the full replacement value of everything we'd left behind, along with a non-disclosure agreement that strongly suggested I not discuss the incident with media or other logging companies. The official explanation was that our equipment had been damaged by a landslide and was too expensive to recover from the remote location. But I knew better, and so did my crew. We'd encountered something in those mountains that didn't belong in any wildlife manual or zoology textbook. Local indigenous tribes had legends about forest guardians that protected sacred groves from human encroachment, massive creatures that were part of the natural world, but separate from the animals that modern science recognized and cataloged. The Cherokee called them by various names, but the common thread in all the stories was that these beings were older than human memory and would defend their territory against any threat they perceived. The Daniel Boone National Forest covers over 700,000 acres of rugged Appalachian terrain, much of it accessible only by foot and relatively unchanged since the days when Daniel Boone himself hunted these ridges. In a wilderness that vast and remote, it's not unreasonable to think that species unknown to modern science might still exist, creatures that have learned to avoid human contact and retreat deeper into the mountains as civilization encroaches on their habitat. Somewhere in the deep woods of the Daniel Boone National Forest, the logger's beast still walks its territory, still guards its domain, and still watches for humans who venture too far into places where they were never meant to go. The old mountain church looked peaceful enough until the congregation started appearing every Sunday. My name is David Hawkins, and I'm a photographer who specializes in documenting abandoned buildings throughout the Appalachian region. I've spent years capturing images of forgotten places, empty coal camps, derelict mills, and churches that stand as monuments to communities that no longer exist. In the summer of 2020, I was driving through a remote section of the North Georgia mountains when I discovered Harmony Baptist Church, a small wooden structure sitting in a clearing that seemed frozen in time. What I thought would be a routine photography session turned into an encounter with the darkest chapter in the region's religious history. The church sat at the end of a narrow gravel road that branched off from a barely maintained county route about 15 miles north of Dahlonega. I'd found the location by studying old survey maps that showed church symbols in areas where no modern roads existed. The building itself was a classic example of 1940s mountain church architecture: white clapboard siding, a simple steeple with a bell tower, and tall windows that would have filled the interior with natural light during services. Despite being abandoned for decades, the structure was in remarkably good condition, as if someone had been maintaining it even though no congregation gathered there anymore. The surrounding cemetery told a different story. Dozens of weathered headstones dotted the hillside behind the church, but what struck me immediately was how many of the graves bore the same date of death: October 1953. Men, women, and children. Entire families buried on the same day with inscriptions that spoke of beloved fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who had gone home to be with the Lord. Simultaneously, the mathematics of mortality suggested either an epidemic or a catastrophe that had devastated this small mountain community in a single day. As I photographed the exterior of the building, I noticed details that didn't match the church's otherwise pristine condition. The front doors were secured with a heavy chain and padlock that looked relatively new, and all the windows had been boarded up from the inside, blocking any view of the interior. Posted near the entrance was a series of official notices from various county and state agencies dating back several decades, warning people to stay away from the property due to structural hazards and environmental concerns. But the building looked solid enough to me, and I'd photographed far more dangerous structures without encountering any official interference. It was while I was examining the newer headstones in the cemetery that I first heard it, the faint sound of singing coming from inside the church. The melody was a traditional hymn, Amazing Grace, sung in the four-part harmony typical of mountain church services. At first, I assumed it was coming from a radio or recording device left by previous visitors, but as I listened more carefully, I realized I was hearing multiple, distinct voices singing together, the kind of congregational harmony that only comes from people who've been singing together for years. The singing continued for about 20 minutes, followed by the rhythmic cadence of a preacher's voice delivering what sounded like a sermon. I couldn't make out the words through the boarded windows and thick walls, but the rise and fall of the speaker's delivery was unmistakably that of an old-style mountain preacher building toward a climactic revelation. Occasionally, I could hear responses from the congregation, "Amen," and "Praise the Lord," called out with the enthusiasm of people caught up in the fervor of religious ecstasy. Driven by curiosity and a photographer's instinct, I walked around the building looking for some way to see inside. The windows were too thoroughly boarded to offer any view, and the chain on the front doors looked like it would require bolt cutters to remove. But on the back side of the building, I discovered a small section of foundation where the boards had warped enough to create a gap about 6 inches wide. By lying flat on the ground and positioning my camera at the right angle, I was able to get a limited view of the church interior. What I saw through that narrow opening challenged everything I thought I knew about abandoned buildings. The interior of Harmony Baptist Church was fully lit, as if electricity had been flowing to the building, despite its apparent abandonment. The pews were filled with people dressed in the simple Sunday clothes of an earlier era, men in dark suits and ties, women in conservative dresses with their hair pinned up in the styles popular during the 1950s. Children sat beside their parents, well-behaved and attentive, as they listened to a tall, thin preacher who stood at the pulpit delivering his sermon with passionate intensity. But there was something wrong with the congregation that made my skin crawl, even as I tried to process what I was seeing. The people in the pews sat too still, their posture too perfect, their attention too focused. They never shifted in their seats, never coughed or whispered to each other, never displayed any of the small, human behaviors you'd expect from a group of people sitting together for an extended period. Most disturbing of all, none of them seemed to be breathing. Their chests never rose and fell. Their shoulders never moved with the rhythm of respiration. I managed to take several photographs through the gap before the service ended and the singing began again. This time it was a hymn I knew, "Shall We Gather at the River," but sung with such haunting beauty that it brought tears to my eyes despite the surreal circumstances. As the final notes faded away, the congregation began filing out through the front doors of the church, moving with the same eerie precision they'd displayed during the service. I scrambled to my feet and ran around to the front of the building, expecting to see people emerging from the main entrance. The doors remained chained shut, and the parking area in front of the church was empty, except for my own vehicle. Yet I could still hear the sounds of people talking and calling out to each other as they departed, their voices growing fainter as they moved away from the building and disappeared into the surrounding forest. Within minutes, the church had returned to complete silence, leaving me alone with the question of what I'd actually witnessed. That evening, I drove into Dahlonega to research the history of Harmony Baptist Church. The local historical society had extensive records of the area's religious communities, and what I learned there explained both the mysterious service I'd witnessed and the tragic dates on so many of the cemetery headstones. Harmony Baptist had been established in 1925 by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Morrison, who'd arrived in the mountains, claiming to have received a direct revelation from God about the approaching end times. Morrison's theology was a mixture of traditional Baptist doctrine and apocalyptic prophecy that focused on the need for his congregation to prepare for immediate translation to heaven. He preached that the faithful would be taken up bodily into paradise, but only if they demonstrated their complete surrender to God's will by participating in what he called the final sacrament. For nearly 30 years, Morrison built a devoted following among the isolated mountain families who found in his passionate sermons both spiritual comfort and social community. The end came on Sunday, October 15, 1953, during what Morrison told his congregation would be their last earthly service. According to the official investigation conducted by state authorities, Morrison had prepared a communion service using bread and wine that he'd laced with enough strychnine to kill everyone in the church. 43 people died that morning, including Morrison himself, in what was officially classified as a mass murder, suicide carried out by a religious fanatic who'd convinced his followers that death was their pathway to immediate salvation. But the historical records also contain details that the official investigation had chosen to downplay or ignore entirely. Several witnesses from neighboring communities reported that the church bell had continued ringing every Sunday for months after the tragedy, despite the fact that no living person remained to pull the rope. Hunters and hikers in the area consistently reported hearing hymn singing coming from the direction of the abandoned church, particularly on Sunday mornings around the time when services had traditionally been held. Most disturbing were the accounts from family members of the deceased who claimed to have encountered their dead relatives in the weeks following the poisoning, spirits who insisted they were not dead but had simply moved to a different kind of service. Armed with this historical context, I returned to Harmony Baptist Church the following Sunday morning, arriving just before the time when services had traditionally begun. I positioned myself where I could observe both the building and the cemetery, with multiple cameras ready to document whatever occurred. At exactly 11 o'clock, the church bell began to ring, its bronze voice carrying across the mountain hollow with the same clear tones it had produced decades earlier when living hands pulled the rope. As the bell continued to ring, I watched in fascination and growing fear as translucent figures began materializing in the cemetery. They emerged from the graves themselves, rising from the earth like morning mist, taking human form. Men, women, and children, dressed in their Sunday best, all moving with the purposeful stride of people heading to an important appointment. They walked through the cemetery gates and approached the front of the church, where the heavy chain and padlock posed no obstacle to their passage. The spirits simply walked through the locked doors as if they were made of nothing more substantial than air. Once again, I heard the sounds of a full congregation gathering inside the building, the rustle of clothing as people took their seats, the murmur of quiet conversations before the service began, the expectant silence as their pastor prepared to deliver his sermon. But this time, I was prepared with equipment sensitive enough to capture what my eyes alone couldn't fully process. using a digital audio recorder and a camera equipped with infrared capabilities. I documented nearly 2 hours of activity that proved the spirits of Harmony Baptist were still keeping their appointment with Ezekiel Morrison every Sunday morning. The photographs I captured that day showed the church interior filled with transparent figures, their forms clearly visible in the infrared spectrum, even though they remained invisible to normal light. The audio recordings captured not just the hymns and sermon I'd heard before, but also the specific words Morrison was still preaching to his ghostly congregation. His message hadn't changed in the 70 years since he'd poisoned his followers. He continued to promise them that their faithful gathering would soon be rewarded with translation to heaven, that their deaths had been merely a transition to a higher form of existence. But most chilling were the voices of his congregation, still responding to his promises with the same enthusiasm they'd shown in life. "Amen, preacher," they called out. "Tell us about the glory." They were trapped in an eternal loop, forever reliving the final moments before Morrison's ultimate betrayal, never able to move beyond the expectation of a salvation that would never come. I made one final visit to the church the following Sunday, but this time I came prepared with items I'd researched as potentially helpful in dealing with unquiet spirits. I brought salt for creating protective circles, iron filings for disrupting supernatural manifestations, and most importantly, printed copies of newspaper articles detailing the truth about Morrison's mass murder. As the ghostly service began, I approached as close to the building as I dared and began reading the historical accounts aloud, making sure my voice carried through the walls to reach the congregation inside. The response was immediate and dramatic. The hymn singing faltered and stopped, replaced by confused murmuring as Morrison's victims began to understand the true nature of their deaths. Through the walls of the church, I could hear Morrison's voice rising in panic as he tried to maintain control over his congregation, but his spiritual authority was broken by the revelation of his deception. One by one, the voices of his followers rose in anger and accusation as they finally comprehended the magnitude of his betrayal. The confrontation lasted for nearly an hour, with Morrison's desperate attempts to justify his actions being drowned out by the righteous fury of the people he'd murdered in the name of salvation. When it finally ended, the silence that followed was different from the oppressive quiet I'd experienced before. This was the peaceful silence of resolution, of spirits finally free to move beyond the circumstances that had bound them to the endless repetition of their final earthly gathering. Since that Sunday, Harmony Baptist Church has remained truly abandoned. The building still stands, but the phantom services have ended, and the cemetery is peaceful. Local residents no longer report hearing hymns or seeing lights in the windows of the old church. The spirits of Ezekiel Morrison's congregation have finally found the salvation their preacher promised, but failed to deliver, though it came through truth and justice, rather than through poison and false prophecy. The photographs and recordings I made at Harmony Baptist became part of a documentary project about the darker aspects of Appalachian religious history. The story serves as a reminder that spiritual authority can be corrupted by human ambition, and that even death cannot always free victims from the consequences of that corruption. But it also demonstrates that truth, however delayed, ultimately possesses the power to break even the strongest chains that bind the human spirit to injustice and deception. The old church still stands in its mountain clearing, and visitors occasionally stop to photograph the building or explore the historic cemetery, but they no longer hear phantom voices or witness ghostly services because the congregation of Harmony Baptist has finally found their way home to the authentic salvation that their false prophet could never provide. In the end, justice proves stronger than deception and truth more powerful than the grave. I was lost for 3 days in the Smokies, but an old woman kept leading me away from the dangerous paths. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm an experienced solo hiker who has spent over a decade exploring trails throughout the southeastern United States. I've navigated through blizzards in the Blue Ridge, survived flash floods in Tennessee hollows, and found my way out of situations that would have left less prepared hikers as search and rescue statistics. But what happened to me in October 2021, during what should have been a routine backpacking trip, through Great Smoky Mountains National Park challenged everything I thought I knew about wilderness survival and the spirits that watch over lost travelers. I'd planned a 4-day solo trek through the backcountry, following a route that would take me from Klingman's Dome to the remote Hazel Creek area via a series of connecting trails that would keep me away from the crowds of day hikers and casual tourists. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect conditions for the kind of solitary wilderness experience that had drawn me to hiking in the first place. I carried enough food and water for 5 days, a GPS unit with backup batteries, detailed topographic maps, and all the standard emergency gear that had kept me safe during hundreds of previous solo adventures. The trouble began on my second day when I took what I thought was a shortcut to avoid a particularly steep section of the official trail. The path I followed looked well established and heavily used, marked with the same type of blazes that indicated official park trails. But as I walked, the blazes became less frequent and the path itself began to fade until I realized I was following nothing more than a deer trail that was leading me deeper into uncharted wilderness rather than toward my intended destination. By the time I understood my mistake, the sun was already low in the western sky, and my GPS unit was showing nothing but a green screen, no trails, no landmarks, just the topographic contours of ridges and hollows that all looked identical in the thick forest around me. I made camp in a small clearing beside a creek, planning to use the morning light to retrace my steps and find my way back to the main trail system. But when dawn broke and I began backtracking, every path I'd taken the day before seemed to have vanished, leaving me surrounded by dense forest with no clear indication of which direction would lead me back to civilization. That's when I first saw her, an elderly woman dressed in simple mountain clothing, who appeared on a ridge about 50 yards away, watching me with the patient attention of someone who'd been expecting my arrival. She looked to be in her 70s or 80s, with long gray hair braided down her back and clothing that seemed to belong to an earlier era, a simple wool dress, a hand-knitted shawl, and sturdy leather boots that had clearly seen decades of mountain walking. When she saw that I'd noticed her, she raised one hand in a brief wave, then turned and began walking along the ridge in a direction that seemed to parallel the course I'd been trying to follow. My first instinct was relief, another hiker who might be able to help me find my way back to the marked trails. I called out to her and started climbing toward the ridge, where she'd been standing, but by the time I reached the spot, she was nowhere to be seen. The ridge offered a clear view for several hundred yards in both directions, but the woman had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. All I found were faint footprints in the soft earth, impressions that looked fresh but were already beginning to fade as I watched. I spent that day trying to follow various ridge lines and creek beds, using every navigation technique I'd learned over years of hiking, but nothing led me in a consistent direction or toward any recognizable landmarks. The forest seemed to shift around me, with paths that disappeared after a few hundred yards and ridges that led to impassable cliff faces or impenetrable thickets. By evening, I was forced to admit that I was thoroughly lost in wilderness that didn't match any of the maps I carried. As I set up camp for my second night alone, the elderly woman appeared again, this time standing at the edge of my small clearing as if she'd been watching me make preparations for sleep. In the light of my campfire, I could see her more clearly. Weathered features that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors, eyes that held a depth of knowledge about these mountains that came only from decades of experience, and a sense of calm authority that immediately put me at ease despite the strangeness of the situation. "You're a long way from where you meant to be," she said, her voice carrying the thick mountain accent of the region, but with an odd quality that seemed to come from all directions at once, rather than from her specific location. These mountains don't give up their secrets easily, especially to folks who wander off the safe paths. I tried to approach her, to ask about the best route back to the main trails, but as I stepped away from my fire, she began backing away, maintaining the same distance between us while shaking her head slowly. "Can't come too close just yet," she said. "You're not ready to see me as I really am. But I can help you find your way if you're willing to trust someone who knows these mountains better than any map ever drawn." Over the following day, The woman became my guide through the wilderness, though she maintained her mysterious distance and seemed to appear and disappear according to her own schedule. I would see her on distant ridges pointing in directions I should travel or standing beside creek crossings to indicate safe places to ford the water. Sometimes her guidance seemed to make no sense. She would direct me away from paths that looked easy and well-traveled, steering me instead toward difficult routes that required scrambling over rocks or pushing through thick undergrowth. But gradually, I began to understand that her seemingly irrational directions were keeping me safe from dangers I couldn't see or anticipate. When she led me away from an inviting trail that headed straight down a valley, I later discovered that the path ended at a cliff face with a 100-foot drop. When she guided me around a section of forest that looked identical to everywhere else we'd traveled, I found signs posted warning of unstable ground and abandoned mine shafts that could collapse under a hiker's weight. On my third night alone, as I sat by my campfire wondering if I would ever find my way back to civilization, the woman appeared closer than she ever had before, sitting on a fallen log just outside the circle of firelight. For the first time, I could see her clearly enough to notice details that made my understanding of the situation shift dramatically. Her clothing, while well-maintained, was clearly handmade in styles that hadn't been common for decades. Her boots were of a type I'd only seen in historical museums, and the tools hanging from her belt, a knife, a small hatchet, and what looked like herbal pouches, belonged to an era when people lived much closer to the wilderness than modern hikers ever did. "You're wondering who I am and why I'm helping you," she said, her voice now clearly audible despite the fact that she still seemed somehow insubstantial, as if I were looking at her through a thin veil of mist. "My name is Elias MacLeod, and I've been walking these mountains since before your great-grandmother was born. I came here from the Scottish Highlands in 1847, following my husband, who'd heard about land grants in the American wilderness. We built a cabin in a hollow about 5 miles from where you're sitting right now, raised 4 children, and lived the kind of life that people nowadays can't even imagine." As she spoke, Elias began to tell me the story of her life in the mountains, and I realized I was receiving a first-hand account of Appalachian history from someone who'd actually lived it. She'd arrived in the Smokies when they were still genuine wilderness, home to Cherokee communities who'd managed to avoid forced removal during the Trail of Tears. She and her husband had learned mountain survival skills from indigenous neighbors, knowledge that had allowed them to thrive in an environment that killed settlers who tried to impose European farming methods on land that required completely different approaches. My husband died in 1892. She continued a hunting accident on a ridge not far from here. My children had grown and moved on to easier living in the towns that were springing up around the mountains. I could have gone with them, but these hills had become more home to me than Scotland ever was. I stayed here until my body wore out in 1934, and even then, I couldn't bear to leave. Too many people get lost in these mountains, good people who just need someone to show them the safe paths home. The truth of what she was telling me settled over me gradually. Elias MacLeod was a spirit, the ghost of a mountain woman who'd chosen to remain in the place she'd loved most in life, using her intimate knowledge of the wilderness to help lost travelers find their way back to safety. She was what the Cherokee had called a guardian spirit, someone whose connection to the land was so deep that death couldn't sever it completely. "But why help me?" I asked. "Why risk revealing yourself to someone who might not understand or believe?" Elias smiled, and for a moment her form seemed more solid, more present. "Because you remind me of myself when I was your age," she said. "Independent, capable, willing to venture into places that intimidate other folks. But also because these mountains are changing, and not for the better. There are things moving through the wilderness now that weren't here in my time. Dark entities that feed on fear and confusion. I guide people like you away from those dangerous paths, keep them from wandering into areas where something much worse than getting lost might happen to them." As if to emphasize her point, a howl echoed through the forest from somewhere in the darkness beyond our campfire. It wasn't the call of any animal I recognized, too deep for a wolf, too structured for a coyote, and carrying an undertone of malevolent intelligence that made my skin crawl. Elias stood immediately, her posture tense and alert. That's what I've been keeping you away from," she said. "Something that's been stalking you since you first got lost, waiting for you to wander into its territory. It can't enter areas where I maintain protection, but it's been following parallel to our route, hoping you'll panic and run in the wrong direction." The howl came again, closer this time, and was answered by similar calls from at least 2 other directions. I realized I was surrounded by something that saw me as prey, and that only Alias's guidance had kept me from walking directly into their hunting ground. As the calls continued through the night, she maintained a protective vigil around my camp, her form becoming more visible and solid as she drew upon whatever spiritual energy allowed her to interact with the physical world. When morning came, the threatening sounds had faded, and Alias announced that it was time for me to find my way home. "The main trail is about 2 miles southeast of here," she said, pointing toward a ridge that looked no different from any of the others surrounding us. "Follow the creek down this hollow until you reach a stone bridge, then take the path that heads uphill to your left. You'll reach the parking area at Cataract Falls before noon." I wanted to thank her, to ask more questions about her life and her ongoing presence in the mountains. But as the sun rose higher, her form began to fade until she was little more than a shimmer in the morning light. "Will I see you again?" I called out as she became increasingly transparent. "These mountains are my home," her voice replied, though I could no longer see her clearly. "I'm always here for those who truly need help. But be more careful in the future. Not every spirit in these wilderness areas is as friendly as I am." I followed her directions exactly and found the stone bridge and trail she described. Within 3 hours, I was back at my car, exhausted but safe, with a story that I knew most people would never believe. But I also carried with me a new understanding of the Appalachian wilderness, as a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than most people realized, where protective spirits still watched over travelers who showed proper respect for the power and mystery of the mountains. I've returned to the Smokies many times since that experience, always being more careful about staying on marked trails and properly prepared for emergencies. But I've also learned to recognize the signs of spiritual presence in the wilderness, the sense of being watched by benevolent eyes, the subtle guidance that steers you away from dangerous paths, the feeling that someone who knows these mountains better than any living person is looking out for your safety. I never saw Alias MacLeod again in the form I'd encountered during my 3 days of being lost, but I felt her presence during several subsequent hiking trips, when weather or terrain created potentially dangerous conditions, a sudden shift in wind direction that warned of approaching storms, an inexplicable reluctance to follow certain paths that later proved to lead to hazardous areas, and on one occasion, the distinct impression of someone walking alongside me during a particularly difficult river crossing that required all my attention and skill. The Great Smoky Mountains are home to many spirits, both benevolent and malevolent, remnants of the countless people who've lived and died in these ancient hills over thousands of years. Some, like Alias, chose to remain as guardians and guides for those who venture into the wilderness with respect and proper preparation. Others, the entities she'd protected me from, prey upon the lost and frightened, feeding on fear and confusion in ways that can lead to far worse fates than simply being unable to find the trail back to civilization. But for hikers who show proper respect for the mountains and the spirits that call them home, the Smokies offer protection as well as challenge, guidance as well as wilderness. Alias MacLeod and others like her continue their vigil over the trails and ridges they knew in life, ensuring that those who truly need help will find it, even when it comes from sources that official maps and guidebooks will never acknowledge or explain.